Hey guys, it's Mr. Metcalf here, coming at you again with another week of exciting history. Um, so this week we are going to kick off starting to talk about early river valley civilizations, and we're going to talk about Mesopotamia this in this video. And the next video we'll talk about the Indus River Valley, and then we'll spend a couple of them talking about Egypt because Egypt has a very long and sometimes complicated history. That's what we're going to do today. Do our best to um, make sure that you understand what we're going with here. So um, we get to civilizations, if you remember, by people eventually discovering farming, settling down, um, growing their crops, learning from each other, domesticating animals, populations growing, people sharing more ideas. Not everybody need to be farmers anymore, right? And it continues on. Okay. Well, civilizations are obviously a lot bigger than farming villages like Cattle Hayek. Civilizations are made up of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people sometimes. Okay. And the ones that we're going to talk about are definitely going to be made up of hundreds of thousands. Um, and they're going to be centers of trade and centers where people come and learn new information. So it's going to be pretty awesome, I think, despite the monotone in my voice. So let's kick it off. Let's talk about Mesopotamia. Okay, so Mesopotamia is an area called the Fertile Crescent, which I believe we talked about already. Um, a lot of it comes from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which curve up and around from the Persian Gulf all the way over almost, not quite, to the Mediterranean. They actually come down from the mountains in Turkey. It's called the cradle of civilization because a lot of people believe that this is where the very first civilizations are. Not the first people, not the first villages, but civilizations. So we're going to discuss that in a minute. And we're going to discuss that at first, talking about ancient Sumer. Okay. So we have to define the word civilization. It's a complex culture with 5 characteristics. A civilization has to have advanced cities, they have to have skilled and specialized workers, complex and organized institutions, record keeping, and advanced technology. Okay, if they don't have those, we don't consider them a civilization. All right. So let's talk about the first civilization, ancient Sumer or the Sumerian civilization. Okay. Ancient Sumer had city states. Okay. Now each city state, basically, they had their own. They had their own leadership. They had their own government. Apart from every other city state that made up Sumer, they had their own militaries. Basically, they were their own independent state. Okay, they also had their own god, right? So each one of these, Eridu, Uruk, Umma, Lagash, Babylon, those are all ancient Sumeria. Those each were their own separate like governments. Okay, now one they had the same culture, right? And they practiced a lot of the same things. They worshiped their gods in the same way. They believed in the afterlife the same way, right? Very little was different, but they had their own governments, um, which really set them apart. Okay, and it's something important to remember. Now, the ancient Sumerians, they started building these big city states, or started their city states started evolving into these large areas, roughly 4,000 BC, so roughly 6,000-ish years ago. Okay. All right. Now, in the city states, to start off with, not so when we keep going down history, but to start off with, priests are in charge of the city states most of the time. Okay. Now, the ziggurat is going to be the temple. And there is a temple in every single city state in Sumer. Okay. Now, what's interesting about the ziggurat, it was not in the center of the city, but it was the center of everything in the city. In other words, it may not have been located in the center of the city, but everybody went there. They worship their god there, as well as the little shrines they had in their house. But that was where the major worshiping went on. The major religious rituals went on. That was the seat of government. In other words, where the ruler for that city state would be, and that was the priest at the time. The economic center, that's where taxes got paid. Okay, it was where trade and food were handed out. All right, so a very, very important building. Okay. Now, if you look at it, it is sort, and you can look up the word, there's a ton of Google pictures out there. There is a little bit of similarity to Egypt's Great Pyramids. It's possible, it is possible that because Egypt's pyramids might have been built a couple hundred years before, that they are a like a knockoff of those pyramids. I'm not 100% sure. So, um, but there's thoughts that it could be. Now, I personally, I personally would say that they are their own original thoughts because there's very similar temples in Central and South America, in India. They're very simple or similar, excuse me. So you know, whether or not they copied from the Egyptians, who knows? But we do know that there are other places that are very similar, not exactly the same, but very similar to the pyramids of Egypt. So I would say that the ziggurat is unique to Sumer. All right, so there's a couple major cities that we need to talk about when we talk ancient Sumer. Okay, and actually there's three, but we're only going to talk about two to start with. We're going to talk about the city of Uruk. Let me see if we can get a pointer here. We're going to talk about the city of Uruk and the city of Ur. Okay. Now, Uruk is considered like the first true city. Okay. Now, Catalhayek, it was a city, but if you think about the population, there was like maybe 6,000 people there. So at its peak, okay, Uruk had between 40 and 80,000 people. That's a lot bigger. That's almost 8 times the size of Catalhayek, right? And so you're gonna, well, you probably have 8 times the problems too, but seriously, it's gigantic. Okay, now um, here's some interesting things about all Sumerian city states, besides the fact that they had their own governments and stuff. Ancient Sumerian city states all had walls, and everything was made pretty much out of mud and brick. There were some timbers, but they had to get that wood from quite a ways away, so it was not very normal. So what they did was to make their walls and things, and some of their walls were like 6 feet thick, couple 20 feet tall, right? So they would make these mud bricks. They'd make a form, and then they'd make these mud bricks, and they'd set them out in the sun until they hardened. Okay, so they're basically sun hardened bricks. Then they would stack them on top of each other, build their wall, right? And then they would cover it over with mud to make a solid layer, so that the bricks weren't showing. And then they would let that dry, and they'd do that a few times, make a few layers, right? So sometimes the walls got as thick as 30 feet, but they were pretty structurally sound, especially for the area that they were in. Okay. Uruk's wall covered a distance of over 6 miles. So it was a large city. Okay. And there was a lot of people that lived there. If we think about the city of Ames, right? Now, people lived a lot closer together. So if you think about the city of Ames, and it's got, with students, maybe 60,000 people. I'm maybe way off on that, but I think I'm about right. But it's way more than 6 miles in its exterior lines are way longer than 6 miles. Um, so Uruk, with 40 to 80,000 people, um, within a 6 mile, it's not a radius because I'm sure that it was not completely a circle; it was more squarish. But you just think about that. That's small for as many people, but they were very prosperous. They were prosperous for a long time. Okay. Now the second city we're going to talk about is Ur. Ur is in a very important spot. Okay, it's the very first city along the Tigris or Euphrates. It's almost right at the Tigris Euphrates where they come together. But it's the very first city along that line that comes from the Persian Gulf. Okay, the Persian Gulf is an important place. You have people from India there, possibly people from China coming through there, possibly people from Upper Egypt coming through there, all to trade their goods. Okay, and they're also going through there to trade their goods with these other places. All right, so very important trade port was Sumer. Uh, they could decide, hey, Lagash needs this, Uruk needs this. We got to get some stuff out to Eridu, right? They could regulate the trade from there, which I'm sure caused some issues, and as we'll see in a little bit. But really, because of their location, Ur was able to amass a ton of wealth. They were a rich city for sure. Okay. Um, and Sumer, you think about it, this is really where we start getting the specialization of workers. You got people that are merchants, soldiers, priests, potters, scribes, teachers, metal workers. Okay, tons and tons of different things. Okay, Sumer is also a civilization of firsts, right? I mean, if you think about this, it's going to make sense why it would be a civilization of firsts. So think about it for just a second, and then look at the screen. So they're really the first to make bronze. They combine tin and copper and make bronze. They kind of come up with the structure of modern timekeeping. All right, now that's an interesting one. They break the day into 24-hour periods, um, and they try and keep those hours the same all the time. And so we kind of model how we do our timekeeping today off of that timekeeping way, way, way back then. They created the first sailboats. Now, it's nothing fancy. They're not super fancy to start off with, but they do create the first sailboats, the first plow, canals, and they used. Does anybody maybe know what they might use canals for? I'll give you a hint. They used them for irrigation, which, if you think about it, it's very important in the area they're at in Iraq. Okay, it is super dry there. There's a lot of sand. So having water be able to get to your fields is extremely important. They created sickle swords. Now, there people automatically, I think warfare. And yes, the sickle sword was used in warfare, but it was also used for farming, right? And we've developed, an even more sickle-shaped sickle today, right? And they use it for farming. People use it to cut grain and things like that. Okay, so that's one of the things they used it for. They were the first to make levees. In other words, like built up land to protect from flooding. Okay, the wheel, right? The wheel. They created the wheel. Now they were crude at first, right? That's a stone wheel, but that's really impressive. Like, who thought? Hey, I wonder if we put something on this. Like, we built this wooden structure. I wonder if we could put some wheels on it and take it somewhere, or somehow make it go somewhere, right? And they figured that out. And from the wheel, they are the first ones to come up with a crude chariot. Okay, so they're going to be the first ones to make this crude chariot, and it is crude for sure. Okay, so a lot of firsts. Now, before I go to the next slide, what innovation, what first was the most important from ancient Sumer? Exactly. It was cuneiform. Okay. Very important stuff. Okay. Now, cuneiform. Basically, it was their writing system and the very first writing system of its kind. Sumerian scribes or professional record keepers invented it, and it was wedged shaped writing. It was mainly impressed on clay tablets, and it was composed of pictograms or symbols representing an object. Okay, at first they used it only for record keeping, But eventually, it's going to be used to tell stories of war, natural disasters, the reign of kings, and even to create the first written law code, the Uru Nammu. Okay, pretty impressive. Now, the picture on the left is Hammurabi's code, I believe. Okay, so oh no, that's the Epic of Gilgamesh. I apologize. That's the Epic of Gilgamesh. I don't have a copy of Hammurabi's code up there, and he came a little bit later anyway. Anyway, so this writing system, it spreads through all of Mesopotamia, and it really has become the basis for many future writing systems. Okay, it is a very, very important development when the world left prehistory and entered the written record of history. Right, so discovering writing like this, now you are going to start keeping track of everything, right? And eventually we're going to get to the internet where there's like nothing that's not recorded. Who knows? Maybe I'm on the internet right now. Okay, so with that, I've got just a short little video to show you guys. Hopefully it works.
On this show, we often talk about the history of people or places, societies. Rarely do we get to talk about the history of an idea. So today we're going to try an experiment. We're going to talk about the history of the concept of the written word. Writing is one of mankind's most enduring technologies. For 5,600 years, this ability to transmit thoughts over generations, to give instructions, to express ourselves, to communicate ideas over the gulf of space and time, has allowed us to make vast strides in our understanding of the universe, our understanding of each other, and our understanding of ourselves. But to understand how writing began, we have to travel back to ancient Sumer, where the first widespread use of writing started. Look around, what do you see? Yes, you see the potters and the merchants, you see streets and gardens, but what do you see looming over all of it? The temples. These temples play a huge part in why writing began. For you see, Sumer was the land of the world's first real cities. Not hundreds of people or thousands of people, but tens of thousands grouped together. And these cities formed city states, bound together by the veneration of a specific set of gods. The people mastered irrigation, and the cities grew. And as the cities grew, so too did the temples to the gods. But these massive, sprawling temple complexes didn't serve only as houses of worship. No, look close. Do you see the men bringing in the clay pitchers full of grain? These temples also served as enormous warehouses, repositories for the vast wealth of the city. In good times, donations and gifts would come flooding in, and in lean times, they would be distributed back out. This system created vast wealth for the priests, but it also ensured that cities of this size could function. But we're not concerned with that, not directly. Look next to the men bringing in the grain. Do you see that man watching them? Notice how every time they bring in a jar of grain, he makes a little mark on that clay tablet he's holding. With an economy of this size, with tons of supplies moving in and out of the temple each day, they needed to keep records somehow, and that is exactly what he's doing. That tablet will later be stored so that priests can know what exactly they have on hand in their giant temple warehouse. But as much as tally marks have their place in the origin of writing, there's something far more interesting for us on that wet piece of clay he's got in his hands. You see, he's drawn a little picture of a grain stalk next to his tally marks, so it's clear that his tallies refer to grain. Well, over the generations, that nice little drawing of grain would get simpler, more abstracted. Scribes looking for quicker and easier ways to note common goods wouldn't laboriously draw every single item coming into the temple, but instead came to an agreed upon set of more symbolic representations for the goods flowing into the holy places. And you can see how somebody might quickly realize that those symbols could represent not only the concept of something, but the word itself. And that's exactly what happened. The symbol for a cow came to be understood not only as a representative of the animal, but also of the word cow itself. But still, there's not much you can do with just a set of 1,000 or so nouns. And here's where a happy accident of linguistics comes in. You see the people talking around the temple? Well, if you could hear them, it would sound like everybody was just saying the same few words over and over again. And that's because Sumerian is a language where most of the words are just single syllables, and where concepts are built out of putting words together. Both of those points are important because when many of your words are monosyllables, it's easy to go from thinking of a symbol as a word to thinking of it as a sound for that word. To go from thinking of the symbol for the U, meaning just the sheep, to thinking of it as meaning the sound U, and thus giving you the word for the tree U or the person U. Once you do this, you're no longer drawing pictures for every word in the language. Now you're starting to think of those pictures as sounds, and stringing sounds together lets you build up all sorts of words. And once you couple that with the fact that in Sumerian, many concepts were built up out of basic words, so for example, sickle plus grain might mean harvest, there's a huge amount you can do with the concepts and sounds that 1,000 or so images represent. But we're not done yet, because the very medium the scribes were writing on changed how we write in the West today. You remember how our buddy in the temple tallying the grain was making his marks on a clay tablet? Well, watch him write. See how he's writing from top to bottom, just as you would if you were making a list. Well, that would soon change because the problem with clay is that it takes forever to dry. And so if you accidentally set your hand down while you're writing from top to bottom, you could easily obliterate whole sections of the column you just wrote. But this risk is reduced if you start writing from left to right. But a lot of the people in the temple didn't like that innovation. It was easier on the scribes, but for the other literate folks who had to read it, they had learned to read from top to bottom, and so they didn't like this sideways thing at all. So what did the scribes do? Well, they simply rotated all of the characters 90 degrees so that a person could turn the tablet and read it from top to bottom just like they always had. Soon, people were just reading the sideways characters left to right. But because they'd been flipped, now they were even more abstracted, even further from the pictures and the things that they originally represented. This writing system was then adopted by the neighboring Akkadians and Elamites, who abstracted it even further. Determinatives, or little markers to designate what part of speech something was in case it was ambiguous, also got added. And now you got a real writing system. The original pictures, and even the pictograms they became, vanished entirely into wedge-shaped impressions and line strokes made by the stylus favored at the time. Which means, instead of simply a handful of nouns to record storage lists, we have a system for writing that can give us things as abstract and lyrical as the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Enuma Elish. So how do we know all this? Well, funny thing about clay, when a place is burned down and all of your writing is on clay, rather than it being destroyed, the writing hardens and becomes preserved. But that won't happen here for some time, so let's just celebrate what scribes like this one and the marvelous city of Sumer gave us. A gift that has lasted us more than 5,500 years. Writing. Now, since we don't get...
Oh, I'm on the screen now. Okay, so back to the slideshow. So it's extremely important, the writing portion of this is, okay? People are going to be able to share ideas easier with each other, and civilizations are going to just explode with growth, okay? So we're going to move on because Sumer is not going to last forever, okay? What happens when you have different city-states, even if they are very similar, is they're eventually going to start butting heads and they're going to fight each other, okay? So after a long, many years of war and things like that, there's going to be a group of people come in called the Akkadians, led by their king Sargon, and this guy is going to start conquering all the divided city-states in Sumeria, okay, as well as the lands in central and south Mesopotamia, basically bringing into existence what many people call the First Empire, the Akkadian Empire. Okay, and you can see he's going to basically control Elam, this whole area here, which is Akkad and Sumer or Sumeria, a little bit up here in the Tigris River. He's going to come all the way over here to Jerusalem, and then eventually a little foray up into Turkey a little bit further. Okay. So basically, this guy, well, not himself. It's more than just himself, but the Akkadian strength, they're going to reign for about 200 years, which for an empire isn't really very long, especially when you consider some of the empires that are going to come later on. Okay, so eventually there's going to be this guy. Oh, come on. There we go. Hammurabi, and he is going to bring in the Babylonian Empire. Okay, now what I have, what's back here behind Hammurabi's name? It is the Hammurabi's Code, not the here. It is Hammurabi's Code, not the Hammurabi's Code. Sorry. Okay, but we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so Hammurabi, he was the ruler of the city-state Babylon, right? Babylon was part of the ancient Sumerian culture that the Akkadians had conquered. Excuse me. Hold on, I need a drink of water. So, Hammurabi, ruler of the city-state Babylon, he regained lands that was once under Akkadian rule. Okay, after about 200 years, they had started to weaken. Okay, and he actually created one of the most well-known empires in ancient history, the Babylonian Empire. Okay, now he was most famously remembered for the Code of Hammurabi, which I'm posting a Hammurabi's Code or parts of it on your remote doc and on Google Classroom, so you guys can check that out. Okay, I would like you to read it, and I think there's a couple questions on there for you to check out as well. So, but basically, this code, even though it's about 300 years younger than ancient Sumerians, Namu, it's still one of the earliest law codes and most complete written legal code in history. Okay, it had 282 laws, and it would influence how justice was carried out in the future cultures and empires. I mean, a lot of people actually are going to take and use this code for their own and base their own codes off it. Now, here's the interesting thing, okay? And you'll see this, I think, when you you'll see some of this when you read through the some of the laws. One thing, so let's go back a slide. Okay, so look at this whole area from Elam through Akkad, Sumer, Akkad. You even have other people over here. Okay, now if you think about it, that is a difficult place if you are going to rule the entire area. There's a whole bunch of different civilizations. It's over a large period. Transportation isn't super widespread yet. There are some newer, modes of transportation, like, using the wheel and stuff. However, still pretty limited, right? So, what do you do? How do you get people to kind of, I don't know, fall in line? Well, and get on board with, maybe having one empire, the Babylonian Empire. So this is what Hammurabi does. He writes this code, right? And he has it put all throughout the empire, the entire empire. There's the laws are posted everywhere. They're not only laws, okay? Hammurabi's code also talks about the consequences for breaking the laws. Okay. You know what? I'm just going to go ahead and look at an example of one of them real quick here. All right. So let's just take a look at. So here's law number 3. If a man came forward with false testimony in a case and has not proved the word which he spoke, if that case was a case involving life, that man shall be put to death. Right? There's quite a few put to deaths. In fact, the first quite a few that they show on here are put to deaths. Okay, so just something to consider. Um, he puts those laws and their consequences all over the empire, right? And if you can station a few troops here and there, then they're like, oh man, he's going to enforce this, right? Maybe you make an example out of one person or something. But it also gives people consistency, right? A ruler who is putting something up, it's a written law. It's not just something, hey, this is the rules. It's actually written. People can see it. Okay, so very important uh, to the people of Babylon. Now, here's the importance of laws. Oh, okay, in a second, here's the importance of laws.
Booking a family vacation in a Verbo means leaving all the craziness behind. Well, maybe not all of it. Crazy feels good when it has room to spread out in a vacation home on the beach with a pool that's private. It just feels like vacation, where your family can get away together. A beach home of your own that's perfectly not your own. Book today and get away together with Verbo.
Did I now? I call on Captain T, keeper of the code. Sisumbaji proclaimed this all to be folly. Hang the code. Who cares? Code is the law.
So just a little funny clip about the law and how important it was. So here's Babylon at the time of Hammurabi. Stretches a pretty good distance. Okay. All right, but even Hammurabi is going to pass away, right? And his son isn't going to be able to hold on to his son Samasu Iluna is not going to be able to hold on to the empire. There's some uprising and some rebellions that are going to weaken the empire. And basically, a group called the Kassites is going to come in 1595 BC, and they're going to take them over. They're going to conquer them. Okay. It's not going to be until about 612 BC, right? So another almost 1,000 years when this guy named Nebuchadnezzar II defeats a group known as the Assyrians, that there's going to be a new era of Babylonian Empire. Okay. And it's the new Babylonian Empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Okay. Now, this is a statue. He's a lion. He's fierce, right? Nebuchadnezzar. He's very well known in the Bible. Babylon, known for its hanging gardens, although they've never found them, but it is one of the seven wonders of the world. But nobody's ever seen them. They've just seen the writings and things like that. So they've been able to maybe kind of reconstruct the. They've been able to reconstruct the gardens, like maybe draw them at least, so they can figure out what they might have looked like. Okay. So Nebuchadnezzar, he's also, not only does he conquer all of Mesopotamia, right? I mean, this is a huge area if you think about it. Okay. Almost all the way over to Egypt. But the guy also destroys the temple in Jerusalem. Okay. And now, obviously, this is a modern temple, but the temple in Jerusalem, and he takes the Jews into captivity and marches them all the way over from Jerusalem to Babylon. That is a long distance over some seriously yucky territory. I've been there, I know. So basically, their empire is going to last for a while. Eventually, even Nebuchadnezzar's empire, the Babylonian Empire, is going to fall. And it's going to fall to this people called the Persians. But that's a whole nother story for a whole nother time. Okay. And we will get to that in another chapter. So we're going to talk about another group of people who's around roughly the same time. They're really powerful as well. They're called the Hittites. All right. Their empire is based mostly in what's modern day Turkey. Back then, right here, back then it was called Anatolia. Okay. Now, this is a gorgeous place to visit. So if you ever get an opportunity to visit Turkey, visit it. They've got beautiful gardens. They've got the most complete set of Roman ruins in the world. The people are super nice. But this is modern day Turkey. In fact, some maps still say Anatolia on there, Anatolia. Okay, so the Hittites, they've been around in this area since about 2000 BCE. They established their empire basically through unification of city-states around 1600 BC, right? So they're not, what they're doing is they're trying to get all these city-states to unify under one government, okay? And they are able to do that, okay? And they become a regional power, okay? They push into what's modern day Syria and Mesopotamia. Basically, they're very militaristic, not like the Spartans, not like the Romans, but maybe the forerunners to those groups of people, okay? All right. Now, these guys are around during the Bronze Age, but here's the cool thing about these guys. Now, does anybody, I ask you to raise your hands, does anybody know what they were the first to craft? Anybody? Iron. Okay. They're the very first to craft iron before any other civilization, maybe roughly around 1500 BC. Okay. They didn't produce iron weapons on a mass scale for their army because it was expensive and iron was still a rarity at the time. However, it was an impressive feat that they could still craft iron. It also made them some fierce competition, right? Even against other civilizations that were super strong. They may have only had bronze weapons. Well, the Hittites had iron weapons. You talk about a difference maker, right? It's a huge difference maker. It's not quite like guns against arrows, but it's a stronger metal. So if you're going up, you can probably chop something bronze in half with a piece of sharpened iron. I'm not 100% sure about that, but it's a way stronger. Okay. Now, um, the heat needed to melt down iron was also much hotter than anyone thought possible, but they did it. They did it. Okay. And there's specific ways they did it. And they had to pump a lot of air into to the area so they could keep the fire going and going and going. Iron swords, though, okay, since they weren't made in mass, they were made for the rich nobles who could afford them, and also used to make decorative statues and vases and things like that, right? So in more of rich people's homes and things like that. Okay, now along with iron, probably one of the most important innovations was the chariot. Okay, they took what the Mesopotamians had and they improved it. They made better wheels. They made it so it was easier for a horse to pull. Okay, they really got horses into it. All right, now about basically they were able to expand their empire because of their chariot battles, and they were victorious in a majority of them. In 1274 BC, at the Battle of Kadesh, the Hittites fought the Egyptians in the largest chariot battle in history to keep the conquered city of Kadesh. Now, although the Egyptians were not able to reconquer the city, the Hittites were not able to crush the Egyptian army as hoped. Does anybody know why that might be? Ah, yes, exactly. Because the Egyptians also had chariots and they were also excellent warriors. Okay. So, after 2 decades of tension and a new Hittite king, the very first peace treaty ever recorded, the very first one, was made between the Egyptians and the Hittites. Pretty impressive. 1258 BC. And it resolves their conflict. And they basically form an alliance with the Egyptians. Okay. The Egyptians taught the Hittites agricultural methods, while the Hittites shared their extensive knowledge of metallurgy. Now, obviously, that's going to greatly influence both cultures. Okay, learning about agriculture and better methods, and then obviously the Egyptians learning about metallurgy, having better weapons. Okay, at their peak around 1350 to 1300 BC, the Hittite Empire spanned almost all of Anatolia, parts of um, northern Levant, or what's now Syria, and upper Mesopotamia. However, as do most empires, um, the Hittite power begins to wane, and there's a group of people called the Sea People. And not everybody is 100% sure who the Sea People are, but we do know that they didn't hit to conquer and take over. They kind of hit and run, right? They would come in, boom, take what they needed and leave. They would plunder, leave, but they were brutal people. Okay, and a group of people known as the Sea Peoples, they basically are going to conquer them and make them weak, and they're not going to be the empire that they were, and eventually they're going to get conquered. You got the Romans, the Persians, places like that are going to come and conquer them. But first, it was the Assyrians. In 1180 BC, the Assyrians landed the final blow and conquered the Hittites, ending the powerful reign of this once great empire. All right, and then so those are the. Just go back here. This whole area. Oh, that was a good picture right there. This whole area. Yeah, it's pretty good. All of this, pretty much. All of this was Hittite. At one point, it's the Babylonians, then the Assyrians, the Akkadians have quite a bit, right? Um, so all this land, civilization is where it's where civilization starts. It's where all these things like the wheel and the sail and the plow and things like that, they're going to push out from there. And as humans expand, um, whether it's to trade or just to share knowledge or even maybe to share their religion, uh, as people are moving back and forth and conversing and sharing their ideas with each other, people are learning from each other, and eventually population is just going to explode, right? In the last 6,000 years, the population of this planet has just and part of that is obviously agriculture leading to civilization, which leads to sharing of ideas and things like that. All right, let's see here. Where are we at? So that's pretty much the end for today, right? We've gone through. Um, we've talked about Mesopotamia and some of the different civilizations there, some of the important things that have been created there. Okay, so this is what I'd like you guys to think about. Okay, here's two questions. First of all, why were rivers so important in the development of early civilizations? That's the first one. So, why do you think rivers were so important in the development of early civilizations? The second question, what was the significance of the creation of writing? And for those answers, we'll have to wait to discuss them until Wednesday. But Wednesday, we will discuss. Okay? Hey, I hope you all have enjoyed this presentation and that you have an excellent day. I will talk at you guys again later.